Hey everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of Top 100. Top 100 is our opportunity to talk through one of our individual top 50 books and tell you why we think you need to read it. What is this week's book for you?
So this week's book for me is The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway.
And why should everybody read this book?
Well, I'm not sure that everyone should read this book, but I think that people should read this book. Hemingway is an author that I think in many ways has fallen deeply out of style in today's sort of literary canon, and for many different reasons. And I think the reasons are actually wrong. There's a tendency to sort of look at him immediately with this idea that he's a misogynist, that he is sort of a hyper-masculine individual, that he was an unpleasant character in real life, without really taking the time to read his books. I think that that is a misreading. And in fact, I think as an author, many of those things that people think that he's sort of an extreme version of, an extreme misogynist, mainly that, maybe an extreme anti-Semite. People are sort of judging him in a very surface level, when in many ways, when you read his books, what you're actually seeing is an examination of those very topics and the way that he experienced them and which were experienced at the time of these books in a sort of ambiguous way. I think The Sun Also Rises is a great example of this. It was it was published in 1926, so 100 years ago this year. So we're, at the 100-year anniversary. The book takes place mainly in two locales, in Paris and in Spain, in the wake of the First World War. The book, some of the main themes in the book are when in the wake of this war, which was considered to be the first almost industrial scale war, in which many, many people died through new machinery, tanks and airplanes. There hadn't been these sort of machines of mass destruction before World War One. There were maybe some examples of it, but not to the extent of what you saw in World War One. That was a huge shock. And coming out of that, many, many people who were involved in the war, they were sort of highly disillusioned. For one thing, one of the things that the war did was it sort of killed off a massive number of young people, of marrying age, of reproductive age. And so you have this sort of sudden emptiness from that, this sort of mindlessness of war, mindlessness of death. And this book is sort of written in the wake of that. You have, like I said, this great disillusionment where the traditional objects or traditional sources of meaning were sort of lost. Things like religion and marriage. These things were sort of, kind of, for lack of a better term, in many ways they were blown up. And this book is sort of following that up. These people are sort of living in the 1920s, again in the wake of World War One, and also in the wake of the Spanish influenza, which killed many, many people. So you had these huge, massive events that had a massive impact on people. Many people died because of both of these things. And now you have these people who have sort of survived the 1920s, who maybe even were in the war. Hemingway, for instance, was involved in the war. And a number of the characters in this book were involved in the war. They're sort of living what many people perceive as a decadent lifestyle. But it's also kind of an empty lifestyle. You kind of get this sense that people are living on borrowed time. For one thing, if you know anything about the 20s, you kind of know what comes next, which is the Great Depression. So you have the 1920s, many American and British expats, and others actually, expats from actually all over Europe and the Americas have moved to Paris. And part of the reason for this is because it's economics. People could live in Paris fairly cheaply, in maybe the way that people live in places like Bali or Thailand today, the sort of digital nomads. People are living in Paris, they're living very cheaply, and they're sort of marginally employed. So people are trying to be writers and artists. And really what they're doing is they're kind of living off of the money that's been left over to them from small inheritances. And they're sort of, like I said, living on borrowed time. You sort of get the sense that this is all going to collapse. This book is sort of talking about this. It doesn't talk about it explicitly, it's very much implicit. And in fact, if you look at the book, it's very much a microcosm of the 1920s. The book is broken up into essentially three parts. The first part takes place in Paris, where you have these expats and they're going to parties and they're drinking and they're sort of, you often wonder what they're doing. They're not working except for one character, the main character, Jake, who is also a sort of stand-in for Hemingway. And then you have a middle portion of the book. This is a portion that's been referred to as a portion of the book that's outside of time. And this part of the book is sort of suggests that for regeneration, one can find regeneration through connection with nature. And so you have these two characters who leave everything. They're in a sort of in-between liminal space where they go on a fishing trip. And this fishing trip is very bucolic. They go to this river in northern Spain, which has been since dammed, and so you can't go there today. And they sort of have these conversations with each other about their lives and about society in general. And they're fishing. And it's sort of, like I said, outside of time. It's outside of the actual events of the book. And then you have the last part of the book, the large part of the book, which takes place in Pamplona. The fiesta that happens in Pamplona. Now, that's a secondary name for this book, is the fiesta or fiesta. The sun also rises. Fiesta refers to the big festival that occurs every year in Pamplona called San Fermin, which at the time that this book took place, which was a much, much smaller affair than it is today. And this is where you see the sort of the world that these people live in collapse. You start learning that these people really don't have any money, that some of them have tremendous debts, that they're sort of living this desperate life, desperate lives, trying to find meaning, and they can't, because essentially their lives are falling apart. And so I think this book is really relevant for today, because what you can sort of look at the last 100 years since this book was written, and you can kind of pinpoint different times in history where things like this, similar things kind of occurred. You can sort of point to the 60s, where you had young sort of hippies who were really sort of young, middle class, not rich people exactly, kind of living these fantasy lives. But these were lives that were very much, in many ways, destined to end, or the party was destined to end. You have something similar in the 90s, where people kind of had this decadent lifestyle. And then that was destroyed by the collapse, the internet collapse and the economy collapse at the end of the 90s and at the beginning of the aughts, and also the World Trade Center disaster. And you kind of, I think, see it a little bit today, where people are trying to find meaning in the world through external sources that are maybe outside of, again, traditional sources of meaning. And these are cycles that continue to happen. And I think that reading this book can kind of help you pinpoint these things and identify them in the time that this book is written, which is the 1920s.
I actually didn't know that this was published 100 years ago. I do wish that that somebody, I say they, but I don't know who they really is. I wish that there was a little bit more hoopla, I think, along or around Hemingway and Fitzgerald and all of those authors who lived in Paris in the 1920s. I think that it's a missed opportunity to resurface those books. But I do have a couple of questions about Hemingway. or about, I guess it is actually about Hemingway itself. There are a couple of questions about the book. I will start with the ones about the book.
Okay.
So what do you think that Hemingway is trying to say to his audience about women by writing the character of Brett?
Yeah, so Brett's an interesting character. He has been criticized in the past for writing women, or some critics will say that his sort of concept of gender is quite skewed. Of course, people consider him to be a hyper masculine figure, even though, interestingly, Jake, the character in The Sun Also Rises, is actually impotent. So he's sort of in this weird place where he's not really fully a male. That's something that gets explored. But many people have sort of suggested that Brett, or some scholars have suggested that Brett is actually really, the way that she behaves is masculine. She's very promiscuous. She's promiscuous in a way that suggests that there's no real biological impact to her promiscuity. In other words, the pregnancy doesn't seem to be a concern for her, for someone who's so promiscuous. I think that's a misreading. I think what Hemingway is really looking at, because so one of the things about this book is that it's what's referred to as a roman à clef. I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but something like that. In other words, it's a book that actually covers real events, and so all of these characters were sort of real characters. So Lady Brett Ashley was based on a character named Lady Duff, something or other, I can't quite remember the name, who was someone that was a person that Hemingway was in love with, and she was a person who had an affair with another stand-in for this book. The character in the book is Robert Cohn, but there was a real person who actually was this character in real life with whom she had an affair, and that led to this huge breakup of friendships among these three people. But I think that one of the things that he's commenting on is, in the 1920s, there's this idea of the flapper, the woman who is a sort of highly liberated Parisian woman who took part in cafe society, who was very stylish, who wore her hair in a bob, who was very sexually liberated. And we tend to forget, when we look at, for instance, feminist movements, the first wave of feminism, the second wave of feminism, that what you have had over the course of history is you have had, especially in the last 100 years, moments of liberation followed by suppression. The 1920s, women, especially a certain class of woman who was educated, who viewed herself as being modern, was really highly sexually liberated. And I think that men felt that this was part of the breakdown of society. In other words, if you have this idea that society should function in a certain way, and something that you expect to function in that way is almost like a breaking of the social contract, then everything sort of falls apart. In many ways, that's part of it. Lady Brett is so liberated that she sort of throws a bomb into the concept of what a relationship, an intimate relationship with someone should be, how people should actually generally behave. She very much sort of behaves somewhat outside of the norms of what maybe Hemingway would have expected a woman to behave, but also what was the norm. In many ways, Hemingway and many men benefited from this sort of behavior. I say behavior, i.e. this promiscuity, this availability. But at the same time, they sort of saw this as being a little bit strange. And I think Hemingway wrestled with that. In many ways, Hemingway tended to marry women who were actually kind of the opposite of that. They were women who were kind of conservative and not particularly sexually promiscuous.
Hemingway married women with money.
And women with money, that's correct. But they tended to defer to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so in many ways, Lady Brett Ashley, sort of the ideal woman, someone that he sort of puts up on a pedestal, but at the same time, he sort of does tear her down somewhat, because there's something in this character that suggests that there is a moral failing in her. But the moral failing also has to be counterbalanced by the fact that Jake himself is so damaged that an actual relationship between the two is not possible.
All right, second question. Hemingway is often seen as a man's author. First part of the question, what is your opinion about that? And do you agree or disagree?
I disagree.
What's the first question, though?
The first question is he's a man's author, right?
Yeah. So what is your opinion about that perspective?
So we're talking about Hemingway broadly, right? We're not just talking. Yeah. So I think that's I think that's a misreading. For instance, if you in this book, there's a lot of gender ambiguity. In fact, in many of Hemingway's books, this is a recurring theme, where gender and the ideal notion of masculinity is often also counterbalanced by its collapse. So for instance, in this book, the main character is greatly damaged through an act of what might be considered to be great masculinity, which is his involvement in the First World War, which leaves him with a grave injury that essentially leaves him impotent. And he can't reproduce, he can't have children, he can't have relationships. In one of his sort of most lambasted books is a book called Across the River into the Trees, which is considered to be almost a caricature of this hyper masculine character who has a sexual affair with this young girl. But also that character, in many ways, in the book itself, is out of step with the world, the modern world around him. Other characters view him as sort of annoying and ridiculous. In a sort of understated way. You really have to look for it, but it's there. And he also suffers from an illness. So he's at the end of the line. This life that this character has built for himself cannot continue. You see a lot of that in his books, where these sort of figures, in many ways, their so-called great masculinity ends up sort of killing them in many ways. It shows, and I think it suggests that this model is not sustainable. In another great book, which is A Farewell to Arms, the character, the hero of this character, is also injured during the war and enters an affair with this woman whose actual great love died in the war as well. And you kind of get the sense that he's foolish, that she kind of sees him as foolish. And she enters the relationship anyway, despite the fact that this person is kind of a foolish figure. Now, that doesn't come through that easily. You really have to read between the lines, but it's there. The other thing, too, is in his short stories. So if you read a short story like Hills Like White Elephants, for instance, or some of his other short stories. For instance, one of his, he talks about actual abortions. And you see that these two characters are in a relationship, and this relationship has actual repercussions. It has, it's not lacking in real world consequences. And you kind of get a sense that the male character in the story is sort of not really reliable. In another short story, you have a clear example of a non-consensual relationship. And you can see in that story how the two characters sort of are just not on the same wavelength. And again, there's great repercussions from that. So I think that I this idea that he's a man's author, I think, is a misreading, and I think it's a tendency to sort of, and this is a problem. Like people, I think with Hemingway, is people think that he's celebrating cafe society and the sun also rises, or he's celebrating masculinity, when in fact it's sort of the opposite. What he does really well, like in any book, like in many books is that he takes something that is actually not really a great thing and makes you like it. We just recently read a book like that, you and I, which we'll talk about in a later video. But this character that does some really, really bad things, you kind of find yourself rooting for him. And in the same kind of similarly to Crime and Punishment, we're reading that and you're sort of like, that he's done a really bad thing, but you're with this character emotionally. And so you sort of say, don't get caught. But of course you should be caught. The same with The Sun Also Rises. You're sort of thinking, well, Paris society, cafe society sounds so great, but actually it's kind of not. And the same with the some of the sort of masculine archetypes, is that in many ways Hemingway himself kind of wished he could be a masculine archetype, but at the same time society was sort of tearing those things down somewhat, and his stories sort of tear those things down somewhat.
So you've talked a little bit about elements of humanity in the juxtaposition between men and women in his books and short stories. What do you think overall Hemingway was trying to say about humanity?
That's a good question. And that's actually really sort of difficult to kind of wrestle with. I think, there's some major themes I think that can be discussed. I think that in many ways, Hemingway is sort of focused on the sort of micro level, his own personal milieu. And I think that's always been the case with him. Whatever book you might read, he was really concerned with that thing. So if you're talking about The Sun Also Rises, it's cafe society and the breakdown of cafe society in the wake of World War I. Farewell to Arms is an even more direct comment on the sort of meaninglessness of that war, and the people who were involved in it. Whether he was writing about, he was really concerned with war for one thing, and although he sort of, some of the things that he was concerned with was the idea of how people behave when they're forced into somewhat heroic positions, or they have to, what happens if you have to be sort of heroic? There is some of that. And sometimes what happens when that's taken away from you? So for instance, in Farewell to Arms, the character gets blown up and he receives a medal. And this medal is sort of embarrassing for the character, because when you ask him, well, what was he doing at the time that he received the medal, this character? The answer is that he was cutting cheese. So he was literally cutting some cheese. He wasn't doing anything particularly heroic. The opportunity to be heroic was taken away from him because of the randomness of war. That war doesn't allow you to actually choose when you get to be heroic or not heroic. In fact, the choice is taken away from you. So some of the major themes that he is concerned about is sort of what do you do? How do you behave in a situation where you have to be heroic? And then again, sometimes that's taken away from you. He was also often concerned with the idea of nature and regeneration through nature, as I said earlier. And this book has a sort of digression in which these two characters are sort of in nature. And but all before that point in the book, other characters are talking about taking trips to like South America or trips to Africa. This sort of idea that by leaving to these places, you sort of leave this decadent lifestyle and you return to a sort of a purer lifestyle. I think that one of the big things that Hemingway also always wrestled with was the idea of death. And so I think oftentimes, especially with the bullfighting stuff, there's a tendency to just sort of view that purely as a topical subject. Like, it's just, he had a fetish for bullfighting. But I think one of the things with Hemingway that he always struggled with, and I think a lot of people struggle with, especially a lot of young men, is, again, having opportunities to be heroic, but also being so removed from those opportunities, you try to find them in different ways. Gertrude Stein had actually suggested to Hemingway that he go to Spain to see bullfighting so he could understand death better. And one of the things about bullfighting that Hemingway learned, and that he sort of suggests why people should see it, is because you learn about death, what it means for the bullfighter, what it means to put yourself so close to death, by sort of passing the bull really closely, the horns really closely to your body. But then what happens with a bullfight? Well, the inevitable end of a bullfight is the death of the bull. And so that's unavoidable, something that in real life people avoid. And I think Hemingway, who, as we know, actually unalived himself, this is something that he sort of wrestled with himself on a day-to-day basis. Well, I say day-to-day. We don't really know that, but certainly towards the end of his life, he wrestled with this. This was something that he was deeply concerned with. And I think that in many ways, that's a theme across all of his books. That the inevitability of death is probably the greatest theme. So trying to be heroic and death.
If someone has never read any Hemingway, he wrote novels, he wrote short stories, essays, he was a journalist.
Yeah.
If somebody has never read anything by him, what is the book that you would recommend they start with, or a short story?
Yeah.
And why?
Well, that's a tough one, because there's I mentioned Hills Like White Elephants.
I mean, I know that we're talking about Sun Also Rises in this video.
Yeah.
And actually, maybe let me change my question.
Yeah.
Are you going to talk about any more Hemingways on your top 50?
Well, I am, actually.
All right. Maybe we save that question
Yeah.
for another video.
Sure.
On which book should someone start their Hemingway journey with?
Yeah.
All right. I obviously cut you off on that question, but is there anything else that you would like to say about this book, The Sun Also Rises, in your recommendations for why everybody should read it?
Yeah, so I would say that the first thing I really highly recommend this book. And I think that, you should, as a reader, I think this is a great book because it really is a window in time to a very specific period. And I think that when you read him, you should sort of get rid of your preconceived notions and try to look at it. I think that people bring a lot of baggage to reading Hemingway. And I think you need to leave that baggage at the door. I think that you'll see some of your preconceived notions may be affirmed in some ways, but I also think that they can also be changed. So I think you need to leave this idea behind, that just purely this idea that he's a misogynist and a racist and an anti-Semite, and actually consider the fact that the instances where these things crop up, in especially in The Sun Also Rises, I think you need to, or I would suggest that you ask yourself, why is he saying this? A great example is Robert Cohen. The thing that makes him sort of dislikable is the very notion of his Jewishness. What does that actually mean, especially today? What does it mean when a character is disliked purely for the fact of his religion? I think that when you read this, don't just think, oh, this is just anti-Semitic, and actually say, what is wrong about this? What is wrong about him? Because I'm going to say that actually, if you think about it, this character is a perfectly fine character. He's got his flaws, and some of them are quite significant. But it's clear that the hatred towards him stems from something more, which is anti-Semitism. So it's not that Hemingway is anti-Semitic, but actually he's saying something about anti-Semitism. So that's what I would say. Leave your baggage at the door. Try to come at this with fresh eyes. Or if you really want to bring your baggage in with you, every time you encounter these things, ask yourself why. What makes this is this really misogynist? Is this character really hypermasculine? Is this really anti-Semitic? Just, I would say, ask those questions as opposed to just allow your sort of preconceived notions to be confirmed. Because I would say that if you do that, if you allow your preconceived notions to be confirmed, then you're not really looking that deeply. And I think you need to look a little bit more deeply. And I think, I think that will help in the way that you even approach these subjects in general.
That's a tall order.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, listening to our recommendation on Fiesta, The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. We will see you next week for another episode of Top 100. If you made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you are notified of any upcoming episodes. It's free for you, but it means the world to us.